What can be said has been said many times about the gentleman I'm about to introduce to you. His story and activity paralleled in interest the history and attainments of the Manhattan Engineer District, the cover name given the United States government's atomic bomb project and its allied developments. Actually, he and the Manhattan District are synonymous. He not only selected its name, but for 3 years weighed his decisions in the face of a suspense and an uncertainty never before equaled. Clothed by the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, in World War II's best-kept secret, he was the officer in charge of the atomic bomb project. He was born 71 years ago in the manse of the First Presbyterian Church in Albany, New York. He attended college at the University of Washington, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and entered West Point in 1916. He graduated fourth in his class from the Academy in 1918 and was commissioned a second lieutenant. He has served in many capacities with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers all around the world, and as Deputy Chief of Construction, he supervised the erection of the Pentagon building in Washington, D.C. In the summer of 1942, he became associated with the atomic bomb project, and after the green light was given to proceed by President Roosevelt on the building of the project, General Groves kept the President, the Secretary of War, advised of the progress. General Groves personally established and supervised the security policies, and so compartmentalized was the construction, operational, and production phases of the venture that only a few persons ever knew its full and complete implications and objectives. General Groves laid down the selection of the areas in Tennessee and in Washington for the Clinton Engineer Works, Oak Ridge, and for the Hanford Engineer Works at Richland, and for placing the ultra-secret utilization project at the site it now occupies in Los Alamos, New Mexico. When it could be told after the atomic bomb drops, it was said he was the driving force behind a $2 billion calculated risk, which was successfully completed in 3 years as one of the world's greatest scientific and engineering achievements, the large-scale tapping of energy within atoms to produce a new weapon of war. He is retired from the United States Army in 1948 and became Vice President of the Remington Division Sperry Rand Corporation, remaining there until 1961. He holds many decorations for his illustrious service in the Army, and it is my privilege and pleasure to welcome him back to Hanford to help us commemorate this occasion and present him to you, ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant General Leslie R. Groves.
This afternoon, Dr. Seaborg and I made an agreement as to how long our total talks would amount to, and I'm going to keep what I agreed to, although I could, of course, talk for the whole time, and then he could just say good evening. I'm not going to give you any formal discussion of anything. I'm going to tell you a few of the facts of life as they were back in 1942 and 43. I'd like to tell you first that there was a mistake made earlier about when the first ground was broken at Hanford. It was actually broken on January 16th, 1943, when I saw the site for the first time and scratched around with my foot to see what kind of foundations we'd have for fast construction. Previous to that, Colonel Matthias and two DuPonters, Mr. Church and Mr. Hall, made this tour for me to look for a site. And we started out because in inducing, and I think that's a mild word to use, the DuPont company to participate, I agreed with Mr. Carpenter, who set as one of his conditions, and he fortunately didn't know that I already felt the same way, that the work should probably not be done at Oak Ridge, and if he found out that he didn't want to do it at Oak Ridge, I would not object to moving it somewhere else. I didn't want to do it at Oak Ridge either, but I always like to give in and let somebody have his own way when that's what I want anyway. Colonel Matthias can tell you a lot of things about that. After the meeting in Wilmington, at which the criteria were more or less established as to what was necessary from a safety standpoint, these three gentlemen started out to make their tour. I would add that on December 1st, the DuPont company had agreed to undertake the work. And their work was to design and develop from an engineering standpoint, to construct and to operate what became the Hanford plant. Before the exploratory mission started out, I talked to them for a few minutes, and I told them that just where the plant was going to be. As most of you may know, I'd been connected with construction. I'd been all over the country. I'd lived in many parts of it, including the state of Washington, but on the other side of the mountains, and I knew the country very well. We also knew where the power was, and I told Colonel Matthias just where this plant would probably be, and I thought you might be interested in that. It was horse heaven. So you see that any of you who served in the Army, a personal reconnaissance is not always necessary. At any rate, we came awfully close to the site. I'd done the same thing with connection with Oak Ridge. There I'd merely said that it should be within about 30 to 35 miles from Knoxville. At Los Alamos, I had said that it should be near Santa Fe, or rather near Albuquerque. And I disapproved the site that had been selected for Los Alamos, what became Los Alamos, and later that day we went over the Los Alamos site and I approved that. When I came out here, we'd already sent real estate officers out here to look over the situation and to make their plans as to how the land would be condemned. And I was supposed to meet Colonel Matthias here to go over the site. Colonel Matthias, though, failed to arrive. He told me afterwards, I think it was either plane or train difficulty. It was a pretty good alibi, and he had people to support him, so I couldn't say too much. But I went all over the site with this real estate officer and agreed, in my mind, that it was a splendid site in every direction. Of course, when we got to Hanford itself, we had lunch there, and I can still remember the little general store on the corner, and I was in uniform, and of course they weren't accustomed to seeing general officers, and it was winter, and I had an overcoat on, a short coat, and of course had the big black bands on my sleeve. But I think these men, almost all of whom were veterans of World War I doubt if they'd seen many generals in their lives, but it made no difference to them. They welcomed me into their midst, and I listened to their noonday chatter, which apparently went on all day long. In general, Hanford at that time looked just like the sagebrush, that is, as an area, It looked just like the sagebrush fields you see as you go up towards the reactor locations. That was the general impression. There was not, the land didn't become valuable agriculturally until we started to condemn it. And I found that in dealing with Congress particularly, it was always well to be able to admit to some mistakes that you didn't mind their knowing about anyway. The ones you didn't want them to know, you never admitted to. But one of the mistakes that we made was that in connection with the time of condemnation, it would have been very unwise from a strategic political standpoint to move the people off as soon as we wanted to, as soon as the reservation was set up, because the crops had been made. They would have been harvested by June, most of them, and I just felt it was wiser not to run into that objection that somebody would be sure to talk about. Well, unfortunately, they had the best crops they'd had in about 20 years, and the prices were high. And the condemnation suits that were brought to court were settled in Yakima, and the juries were Yakima farmers who were used to Yakima production prices, and we paid an awful lot for this land, much more than I thought was reasonable, but that was done. I always think it's very important to realize that no matter how well anyone does a job, you always make mistakes, and usually those mistakes come about through an attempt to be reasonable or to be kind or to do something else. When we broke, from that time on, this thing moved along very smoothly. There were a few difficulties, but not too many. We had trouble getting labor. We had all the things that you've all heard about. But I wanted to give you that first impression and how we happened to come here. There were several reasons. One was power, one was the Columbia River, and we were more fortunate in that than we realized when we made the choice. And the other thing was that, which was all important, was an ability to construct the year around, and despite all the venomous remarks that have been made about the dust storms, you could work out there. And from the letters I get from my son in Vietnam, the dust there outside of the rainy season is much worse than it ever was in Hanford. And also, nobody was shooting at you. The other thing that I think is important to remember is what made this project as a whole a success. Actually, it was the triumph of what I've always termed the American way of life. And I think one of the most important features in that was the role played by American management. And that meant the management of these big corporations and the sub-management of those corporations. We'd always thought, those of us who had been around the country, that nothing could be much bigger than DuPont. But you know, this project strained the DuPont resources to the limit. They had to abandon one munitions plant and turn it over to another company because they simply needed the people out here. And we had, for example, the man who took over the commissary when we had trouble with it was an engineer. I think we still retained the original subcontractor. But before he came out here, he'd been the general manager in the construction of the Gopher Ordnance Plant near Minneapolis, and that was only a $100 million job. People who had been managers of smaller installations, maybe 35 million or something like that, came out here and were assistant area superintendents. And that was what we thought was necessary to do the job. The idea of something like the pile having to be generally a cube and accurate to a quarter of an inch was something that's unheard of in construction activities. It just hadn't been done. That was the type of thing that was fine machine work for things like automobiles, when we weren't so disturbed about safety requirements as we seem to be today. But that was typical of it. Everything was new. We didn't know how to make the metal. We didn't know how to can the metal. In fact, we hardly learned how to can it in time. We didn't, there's so many things that were unknown. When I first talked to the DuPont company, I asked two of their senior vice presidents, one of whom I knew, to come to Washington to talk to me. And I told them what I wanted. And they sort of threw up their hands in horror, and their first remark, and what I've heard from DuPont for years, was that we're chemists, we're not physicists. And there was some question as to whether they even had one physicist on their payroll. I think the first real physicist who joined them and worked with them was Dr. Wheeler, and they leaned on him so heavily I was always surprised that his back didn't break. Of course, he was more than a physicist. He was the most unusual one, and we had a lot of unusual ones, but not unusual in that way. He understood the problems of the engineer and of the whole business world, and he had the DuPont organization eating out of his hand. All they could say to me was, "Can't you find a few more like Dr. Wheeler to come up and help us?" Some of the others were a little bit difficult at times. But the physicists managed to put across this great, it isn't the first time the American people have been brainwashed, but they put across the great idea that the physicists did this job. Well, everybody did this job. And among the scientists, don't forget the chemists. After all, I think this was really more chemistry than it was physics in a lot of ways. And I know tonight that Dr. Seaborg will not disagree with me on that question. But the physicists had been hungry for years. They'd never received any attention. The chemists were used to dealing with industry. The physicists were in their laboratories in colleges, and more or less, I imagine, a little bit disgruntled because of the consulting fees that their brethren in the chemistry department usually got. But in any case, this was a field that required every possible bit of scientific effort we could put on it. It required physics, it required chemistry, it required biology. And when it came to building, it required all the things that go into being able to design things like you saw in the tunnel today, all of which, of course, had to be capable of being taken apart by remote control. All of that design work, it had to work, and it had to work almost the first time. You've all heard about the xenon poisoning that's been referred to today, but I'd like to point out that the reason we got into trouble out here was because the physicists in Chicago thought they knew more than they did. And they failed to obey the direct orders that I had given that experimental pilot Chicago be run 24 hours a day around the clock, all through the weeks and through the months. Of course, if they'd only run it instead they said afterwards they explained that they'd gotten all the information they needed during the daylight hours, so they had just knew it wasn't necessary to do that. Of course, if they'd done it for even 18 hours, xenon would have been predicted. And there were a few times that we had to interfere with some of the scientific prognostications. One of those was the thing that saved the files, and that was the provision of the extra tubes. When became such an acrimonious argument between DuPont and the Chicago physicists that Mr. Reed, the chief engineer of DuPont, came to see me about it. And he apparently thought that it would take a long argument. And as soon as he told me that the physicists wanted to design this right down to the finest point with no margin of safety, I said, well, I hope you've put in at least 25% safety factor as a minimum. And he was so surprised he almost fell out of his chair. He didn't have to argue at all. It was just a common sense engineering approach. And as you know, that's what saved the Hanford piles. All I can say is it has been very embarrassing for me to have to tell the Secretary of War or the Chief of Staff that Hanford had failed because we were too stupid to use normal engineering precautions. But to get down to what made this a success, and I'd like to tell you that and leave that thought with you. It was the triumph of the American way of life, American management, the government support that we got, the unlimited authority that I had, and I wasn't given that authority. I was just told to take charge. And then I found out after a little while that nobody wanted to interfere with me because they couldn't understand what we were talking about. And they also were certain that it was a wild goose chase and would be a failure, and they didn't want to have any responsibility for that failure. Make no mistake about it, I knew what my chances were, and I estimated them as about 60% to be able to do it during the war. But I still told General Marshall that I thought we should go ahead primarily because of the dangers of the Germans getting there first, and also because I didn't believe that we could finish it in time of peace under our American way of operation. Then we had the support of the state and local authorities. We had it out here particularly strongly. We had the support of the newspapers in keeping our security. And we had a tremendous advantage in the number and the youth of our American scientists who had been increasing in great numbers during the Depression years and who were young enough not to realize that it couldn't be done. Now that was really the basis of it. As Dr. Seaborg told you today, he was 30 when he went to Chicago. He had a compatriot who was the head of chemistry at Los Alamos, Dr. Joe Kennedy, who I think was 27 at the time. And those were the men we depended on, but we also tried to see to it that what their recommendations were sound, that they knew what they were talking about, that they weren't just some curbstone opinion. But above all else, it was, I think, the whole strength of America, the strength that's there, and the strength that I think will always be there. I'd like to express my real pleasure in being here and seeing so many old friends, and particularly, you didn't think I was a friend, but I really was, and because I depended on you, and you didn't fail me. Thank you very much.